You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Stephen Jones. He is an economist for the U.S. Coast Guard. Stephen, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks. It's great to be here today. Just want to briefly point out that I'm an economist for the U.S. Coast Guard. Nothing that's said in here reflects Coast Guard policy, stances, or anything official. I'm talking about my own research, and this should have no bearing on Coast Guard or agency decision-making.
So on that note, our topic for today is a paper you wrote on regulatory discretion. So, Stephen, let's start just by defining regulatory discretion. What does that mean in this context? Sure.
So I think first off, we should probably define regulation, because when Congress writes a law, they pass the law on to regulatory agencies, and it'll say something to the effect of agencies issue a regulation. So when we talk about regulation, sometimes this point isn't always clear because people aren't familiar with this process. The regulation is a statement that either clarifies existing congressional law or is written, say, directly in response to congressional law. And this could be as specific as, say, Congress can direct an agency to set, an exact amount of pollution that is permitted for an industry, to as broad as saying something like protect consumers from unreasonable risks. And then the agency has room to interpret that statement as wide as it wants to. So when I talk about agency discretion, what I'm really talking about is Congress wrote a rule that gave the agency power to issue legally binding rules that may or may not trace directly back to Congress.
Yeah. So in the example you use with the pollution one, Congress has something fairly specific in mind, a specific type of pollution, but the agency, might have to clarify and to say, what counts as pollution, how much they're measuring it, and maybe what they might establish, like a quota system. They might have specific rules for specific firms. And in the other example you gave, which is just, protecting consumers from unnecessary risk, in that case, they can basically write rules as if they were their own legislature. They're essentially doing what Congress is ostensibly meant to do. Is that correct?
I'm not sure I would go that far. So there's various theories of the purpose of the regulatory apparatus in the bureaucracy. And so some people would say that, some people, I cite them in my book or in the paper, Baumgartner and Jones and Workman. One's called The Politics of Information, and I forget what the other's called. It's Workman 2015. And their theory instead is that, Congress gives the agencies discretion because Congress doesn't know the problems it needs to solve. And so the agency is kind of like the specialist that is subcontracted to figure out what Congress wants them to solve without actually knowing, say, the relevant information to determine that. That's one theory. You've got other people like Philip Hamburger, notably, who's written a whole book on how administrative law, which is another word for regulation, is unlawful. And so he goes through sort of the common law tradition and cites numerous evidence to say that exactly in the way that you put it, that it's a deep legislative function and only Congress should be performing that. And so whether that's true, I think depends on a number of different assumptions that aren't always discussed directly in the literature. That would be my interpretation of it, if that makes sense.
Right. And of course, we're approaching this from an economics standpoint, so there are important public choice issues involved with this. The same rule, whether it's written by a legislature or a bureaucracy, a regulatory agency, it's the same rule. And so in principle, there should be no difference. But the important thing is that the agency and the Congress may have different incentives and may write different rules. Is that That's what I interpret as sort of an important underlying theme in your paper.
That's most certainly true. So that's actually one of the things that frustrates me greatly about reading a lot of these other, I think, great researchers who don't, in my opinion, sufficiently consider the role of incentives in how and what. And so to couch it in Vogelmautner and Jones and Workman's terms, okay, let's assume that the purpose of the bureaucracy is to create the information that's necessary to solve the national problems, whatever these supposed national problems are. Why would you assume that, bureaucrats would would supply the right amount of information in the right ways consistently throughout time? And it's not clear to me that those incentive systems are ever worked out, or if you do work them out, I don't think it actually shows that, bureaucrats are beholden directly to Congress. So the big term in this literature, which comes from McNoll-Gast, which is McCubbin's, Knoll, and Weingast in the 80s, is called congressional dominance. And they basically say that because Congress writes the rules, they structure all the incentives and have all the tools at their disposal to monitor and police agencies. And I'm just, I think, deeply skeptical that works as well as they describe.
Right. Your paper mentions the Administrative Procedure Act, which is sort of an attempt by Congress to keep these agencies in check. Could you describe that act and what exactly it does?
Sure. So the Administrative Procedure Act is the main document that governs how agencies regulate. It defines the process by which regulation is made. And the chief component is that it really says before an agency issues a regulation, it has to go through notice and comment. And what that means is when it sends out a rule, it issues it in the Federal Register, which is the government's journal of record. And then it allows everybody to comment on this rule. And literally anybody will comment on these rules. And the agency is legally required to respond to all comments. So the basic theory is this. It's kind of got a two-part mechanism here. On the one side, it's a sort of direct structural constraint and doesn't really affect agency decision-making because all it's really saying is you have to send out if the fire alarm is triggered, it acts like a fire alarm. So if you get a whole bunch of comments, it's a really easy way for Congress to tell, oh, there's a problem with this policy, or it's a contentious policy because all of these people commented and it's really loud. It's like a fire alarm. But it doesn't necessarily mean that an individual bureaucrat in that agency really feels that alarm. It's more like it'll just be triggered and it's make sure to just do something that doesn't trigger that alarm and you should be okay. The other way in which it might change agency behavior is that by forcing agencies to publish rules, they reveal a lot of information. And you also have to, in the rule itself, you have to describe, say, the costs and the benefits. You have to describe whether or not it has impacts on Native American tribes or on the federal structure or various other executive orders that have been issued. So one of the main ways, in fact, that notice and comment system has changed is via executive orders that define how, in a very practical sense, these final rules will be constructed. And so they're all today reviewed in an office inside of the OMB, the Organization for Management and Budget. And the office is called OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. And so they're responsible for reviewing all regulation, and they're an office of the president. So some people then conclude that the president has all this power and effect on rulemaking in general as well.
Well, I guess the idea of the president is that it's the executive branch, and so it executes, and it sort of makes sense that these agencies that are executing laws would ultimately be beholden to the president, or it sort of fits. So, do you know, like, quantitatively, like how many comments, like, do these regulatory agencies, are they writing regulations and getting hundreds of comments every time, or is it rare to get even one comment?
It depends on the agency and it depends on the rule. So EPA, because many of its rules will have national effects, and then there's national environmental organizations that you could say are key stakeholders in the outcome of all of these rules, could very easily generate hundreds of thousands of comments. And so they'll actually have computer programs that like scrape the comments and kind of try to sort them into boxes. You have other organizations that, like a FRA, for instance, they might have a rule that only gets 30 comments.
Sorry, what does FRA stand for?
Sorry. That's the Federal Railroad Administration. And that's one of the two main regulators of railroads in the United States. The other regulator, the Surface and Transportation Board, is primarily focused on business practices, antitrust type issues. And FRA is focused primarily on health, safety, and welfare of anything railroad related. So that's everything from, say, the occupational safety of railroad workers to the safety of passengers on trains. So the Federal Railroad Administration might only get 30 to 40 comments on a normal rule. They might even get less than that. It really depends on the rule itself.
Okay. So, typically this would be, if a rule affects my business and, I might pay attention to the new rules coming out in my industry. And if one I thought was going to be detrimental to my bottom line, if I'm work for or run a private business, then I would comment. Is that the typical thing that happens?
Probably. I really think the diversity of interaction is so high, it's really hard to characterize exactly what normal public commenting looks like. Because it could be everything from, I'm a regulated businessman who wants this, to there might be somebody on the other side who benefits directly because the new rule sets a standard and the standards organization writes in and says, your standard isn't strict enough. Two, it could be something like there's a proposed rule that the Federal Aviation Administration, which regulates commercial flying or anything air related at all, pretty much. And they have a rule on the use of cell phones on planes. They've got about 5,000 comments, 6,000 comments. That's quite a number. Once you get above 100, that's usually like quite significant. And those are on a lot of those could be something as simple as we just think, phones shouldn't be on planes, and just average citizens writing in upset at the very concept of a phone being on planes. So it really could, there's quite a diversity of interactions between the agency and public on that.
So getting into the main topic of your paper, you discuss what you call channels of influence. So what are those and why are they important?
Yeah, so the way I think about it is this. I think the chief question of the bureaucracy literature is, who does this regulatory bureaucracy exist for? Does it exist for interest groups? Does it exist for Congress to ultimately provide information that Congress needs? Does it exist for the president to carry out the president's wishes and his policy? Or does it exist for the bureaucrats themselves, which is the one I also like to emphasize, because the literature on that one is not very common today. It was more common, I think, about 30 years ago, but the framing of it is a little different. And so my point is to say each one of these separate groups should have an effect on the outcome itself of a final rule, which changes, say, the regulatory set. Some rules may be demanded by bureaucrats. Some rules are demanded by interest groups in Congress. And so if I were to put it into econ speak, because I'm writing this paper probably more for a political science literature, but if I were to put it in econ speak, I'm kind of saying you have four different demanders for this product. And so who is the regulatory agency really supplying this for? Is, I think, really how I'm thinking about it.
Right. And I mean, what really struck me about your paper is that you're able to quantify this, which, I mean, I think if I had just read, about channels of influence, I wouldn't have been immediately obvious that that's something that you could potentially measure and, quantify and compare statistically. So how do you go about quantifying something as nebulous as channel of influence?
I had to read a lot of rules. So I think I'm the first person to go out and do this. And how this kind of started was I was lucky in that I was gifted with the right circumstances in a lot of sense. I wanted to do something more ambitious using a kind of statistical approach. And that kind of fell through because there were some issues in the data that I just was not anticipating beforehand. And so I kind of went back to the drawing board and said, how do I make this, more simple? So my first cut was I wanted to figure out how much discretion and in rulemaking there was, because I've not seen anybody estimate that. So immediately just thinking about how hard it is to get discretion, aside from channels of influence, let's move aside channels of influence for now. How do you measure discretion? It's not like agencies usually come out and say, this rule is discretionary. It's not like in the Code of Federal Regulations, they say from here on out, these are all of the rules that we really didn't need to do, but we decided to do anyway. And then there's, if you think of it like that, there's also another way in which there's discretion that I completely ignore in my paper so far. I probably should put something in there for this. But there's also discretion in the sense of if Congress tells you to write a rule, the agency can kind of determine how light, how heavy, in what way, in a lot of senses. In my paper, I assumed that wasn't discretionary. So I really only have a much blunter instrument. And so I needed clear signs that something was discretionary or non-discretionary. And the way I went about that is I just read about 160 rules issued from 1980 to present day. And most of the time, they'll state this rule comes from X public law, and then they'll state something to the effect that then they'll usually state the legal text from that public law. And most of the time, when I read the legal text, I could pretty much tell if the agency was required to do it or if they were suggested to. So sometimes they might say, the agency shall consider issuing a regulation. In that instance, I'd count that as discretionary because at the end of the day, the agency could have said, no, I'm not going to do this. And so my measure of discretion really started from just saying, well, I can kind of figure out what statutory is, and then I'll call everything that's not statutory discretionary.
Okay, so you gave examples before of, for instance, Congress ordering an agency to regulate a certain type of pollution, to a certain level. That would probably be non-discretionary, an example of a non-discretionary rule because it's very specific and, maybe there's like a very small amount of wiggle room, but it's fairly clear what needs to be done if you're handed down a law like that.
Well, there are other times Congress will say, conduct a study and then issue a rule on passenger brakes, for instance. I counted that as non-discretionary.
Oh, wow.
Because they had to conduct a study and then they had to issue a rule.
Okay. Well, it's just in that case, they have so much discretion over, how to perform the study. And then, depending on choices they make, the study could have, a different outcome and then the rule could be different. So it sounds like you were fairly strict about what you count as discretionary. It has to be extremely open-ended. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I wanted to count something as discretionary. I wanted no citation to public law. And if there was a citation to public law, I wanted it to be clear that citation said you must issue a rule. If they kind of left it open to like wiggle room of like, you can kind of think about it. I said, no, we're not going to count that as non-discretionary. But if they are, if they're going to require it, I think that has to be mandatory, even if it's kind of open-ended how they implement it. Yeah.
So that makes the actual results in your paper somewhat lower bounds on the level of discretion. We're talking about things that are very clearly discretionary, and so any sort of numbers that we quote are going to really be low balls, or a lower bound on how much discretion these agencies have. So, quoting from your paper, you say that between 1980 and 2015, approximately 42.9% of all measured word count changes in regulatory text were discretionary. And for the same period, 88 out of 163 rules, or 54% of all final rules issued, were discretionary. So those are some of the numbers quoted in your paper. Could you say a little bit about what they mean? It seems very high. It seems like there's a lot of discretion indicated by that.
That's my hope, is exactly that. That's exactly what that indicates. I had a knee-jerk reaction that there is a lot of discretion, because why else would you have a massive regulatory agency with a staff of, in this case, I think about 300 people, which is a small agency, if you weren't going to give them real duties and responsibilities. One of the things I think people don't think about is that you don't need a regulatory agency to enforce things. You could substitute the entire regulatory enforcers with binding court cases.
Right.
Make everything tortious liability. Set everything as a liability rule, where if you're not performing on this standard or whatever, any person that is on your train can sue you for not providing the right care. You no longer need enforcers from the government. So when a lot of people, I think about regulatory agencies, they think about kind of like the guys with clubs that like show up and are like, you don't have the thing you're supposed to have, and we're going to issue you fines. But I think that actually misunderstands the function of the agencies, because that's actually the least important part. That part you could totally get rid of tomorrow if you wanted to. I think the part that is actually necessary and distinct is the part where they produce regulation or rules that we don't have coming from Congress.
Okay, so the function of actually enforcing the law could be done by ordinary police or a branch of law enforcement, but what differentiates these regulatory agencies from police is, I believe you're saying, is the fact that they also write rules, which police generally do not.
I'm actually taking it a step further and to say, in most cases for regulation, you don't actually need the police, because what you have the police there for is to catch criminals who will use the means of violence to subvert the law. When you're talking with regulatory agencies, I don't think anyone thinks most private companies would use violence to subvert the law. What's really going on is you have what a regulatory agency is doing is saying the package of goods that you're providing does not have the right portfolio of risks. And we've decided that you need to have a different portfolio of risks. And so we're going to make you do that. I don't think you need cops, because there's no overtone of violence in this process. All you need is the ability to sue over that condition. And then any person could say, walk on a private company's, set and say, you're not, doing your job, file a tort, get his money back plus damages, problem solved. My point isn't to say that is a realistic solution, or that would be sort of immediately workable. I'm just saying I don't think theoretically there's a reason we need the enforcement part to be internal to a regulatory agency. It seems to me not the essential function of a regulatory agency. I'm not saying that we should do that. I'm just saying it's very possible to exist in a world where the regulatory agency isn't also the policeman.
Right. So I guess in a more general discussion about regulation, the difference between torts, which you mentioned, and a regulation is that the tort comes after your dangerous product injures someone. The regulation comes before and tries to make your product or your business or whatever it is you're doing, safer or better in some way as determined by the agency or the Congress before you act, right? So you have to make your cars meet a certain safety standard, as opposed to make your cars meet a certain safety standard or potentially expose yourself to lawsuits when people get hurt because of your cars.
I'm actually saying, though, that it wouldn't operate in that way, because you could just make it that you could sue over somebody not providing the equipment or the safety standard that you're expected to provide. So you don't actually need the accident, right? Not just having not the scrubbers or whatever device it is that you're supposed to have on your vessel or on your train or on your factory, right? Just the observance of not complying could easily be something that, you could sue over if under this different institutional structure, right? So what I'm saying is, you got to think, so the tort is the punishment comes after the crime, but the punishment in regulation still comes after the crime, right? So like the non-compliance with regulation in time, so the regulation's authored in time A. In time B, business doesn't comply with the regulation for whatever reason. Time C is when the regulator gets around to applying the fines on that behavior. There's no reason you couldn't just require or allow individuals to notice, say, deviations from the federal code of regulations and then sue over that. And then get a whole bunch of money because the company wasn't complying with the rules. And all that they'd have to show is some modicum of evidence that they weren't complying. And so I think that would be actually far more effective than the present structure of getting firms to comply with whatever arcane rules are in the regulatory set.
Okay, and so at least ideally, most firms are going to obey most regulations. So the enforcement is sort of important. It's important. I mean, if they knew that you weren't going to enforce your rules, obviously they wouldn't follow them. But the enforcement is sort of a small part of the whole regulatory system. And the point you're making is that it's writing the rules. It's agencies as rule makers and as bodies with the discretion to write rules in ways that they see fit, and potentially according to the incentives that they face, they can write those rules however with a certain amount of discretion. Yeah,
correct. I'd make one sort of little note of difference, which is to just say they'll write the rule subject to the constraints that they face. Mm-hmm. And in a lot of instances, so the number of regulators is a small part of an agency generally. The largest part of an agency is usually its enforcement division. And so that's why I think a lot of people, when they look at regulatory agencies, they think about that, because most people that have an interaction with regulatory agencies, it's with the people that show up at the door with, and say you're non-compliant. But the word regulators in there, I think it's really about agencies issuing rules and guidance and stat and structuring the way other people behave. It's not per se about the enforcement.
Okay. So one thing that was really interesting in your paper is that you're able to break down how many rule changes were motivated by different groups, whether those groups were Congress or, the executive branch and the president, or private interest groups, or even the bureaucracy itself. So first, how were you able to determine, who was motivating a rule change?
So I looked for the clearest signal that I could find, which unfortunately means it's exceptionally broad struck. And I don't know how, let's say, good my estimates are that I provide, but they're better than anything else that's out there. So that helps. And And because I think this is the first attempt that I've seen, at least, of a real sort of racehorse kind of comparison of who's controlling the bureaucracy. So I look for clear signals. So a clear signal could be an executive order, and the agency saying we're doing this to comply with the executive order from the president. It could be an interest group petition. So an interest group may request that the agency regulates for a particular reason, and so they'll send a formal petition in and say, please issue a rulemaking on this because, and that could be anything from we'd like you to deregulate because technology has changed, so we really want to use this newfangled technology, but we can't because your stuff is outdated, to a particularly funny example in Federal Railroad Administration rulemaking is there was a petition for FRA to regulate toilets on trains in the front cab, which was specifically because something between management, environmental groups, and unions got in kind of like a big kerfuffle over how to deal with when the cab driver, when guy sitting in the front wants to poop. And so they'll poop in a bag. And so sometimes apparently there were people just throwing the bags out the side. And so a lot of people just, I believe FRA's first response was industry and union, figure this out on your own. And I think they weren't able to come to an agreement. So that kind of led into FRA creating this rule over this. So, I mean, it really, the set of things that regulation may cover, the sanitary conditions of bathrooms in the front of trains is one of them. And then for Congress, I looked at any congressional action that was mentioned in the rule. So that could be congressional hearings, that could be a GAO report, which is the Government Accountability Office. So think of them as Congress's personal think tank. And their job is to go and investigate things for Congress, which frankly, this is my own sort of bias coming out here. But if Congress can already have its own think tank that can go and find things, why don't they just make that a super souped up version and just have that instead? If congressional dominance was really the thing that mattered, why don't we just have like a really big GAO where Congress is clearly dominant and there's a bureaucracy that is beneath Congress providing Congress with exactly what it wants at sort of its beck and call, and not have probably like 200,000 people employed in the executive branch agencies involved with like the regulatory process, or however many people it is. I'm not sure of the exact number. I just know it's large, and it's not that it's a very large number of people. I think Susan Dudley's work at the George Washington Center's kind of fiddled with the federal budgets to figure out a number of employees. I think might be in the million. It's a large, a couple tens of thousands would be if I remember right. It's been a while since I looked at that. And so I looked at hearings, I looked at GAO reports, I looked at if the so to get back to your original question of how did I discretion with Congress, if Congress said you should consider issuing a rule, I labeled that as Congress's channel of influence. So that was, I think, kind of my way of balancing the sides. And then everything left over, I pretty much assumed was bureaucracy's effect. More so I assume this is an upper bound for bureaucracy's effect, which again is kind of kind of not really truth telling in the sense that the bureaucracy has discretion in how it implements everything, and I'm not categorizing in that way. So bureaucracy's actual effect will to a degree be understated because I'm not measuring the intensity of its discretion across the rule set, if that makes sense.
And your upper bound estimate was around 45%, mid-range was 35%?
Yeah, so there's a group of rules that's about 30% of rules between 1996 when it starts and present day. About 1/3 of rules went through this process, and it's called RSAC, which is the Rail Safety Advisory Committee. It's a negotiated rulemaking process pretty much, which means you have the FRA on one table, the unions on another table, and industry on a third table. And you have a bunch of observer stakeholder organizations. I think Canada Rail's an observer, Mexico Rail's an observer, the National Transportation Safety Board's an observer, and then probably a couple others. And they kind of negotiate on the final text of a rulemaking project or the full text. So it could be something as broad as, so FRA will come to them. And so the way this works is FRA comes to this organization and says, consider, if we should have a rule on X topic, what that should be like. And so then there's a committee formed that basically debates and discusses what they should do. And the main idea is that between the railroad administration, the railroad unions, and FRA, those are pretty much the parties that are affected. And so if the three of them can come to a negotiated solution, it's probably pretty good for all parties. And my point was, I have no idea how to categorize this, because it's this football almost that's just put in front of everybody. And then everybody's kicking it in every direction to suit their own benefit. So you have FRA on one side, the union on the other side, and then railroad management on the third side. And so my generation of the high, medium, and low is entirely based on how I would assume these played out. And so I said, let's assume that 100% of these rules are all, motivated by FRA or the bureaucrats themselves, because they're setting the agenda. So they do have a strategic advantage. And there's a whole literature on how setting the agenda really matters. And then my mid-assumption was assume that only 50% of this rulemaking was, responsible to them. And the other 50% is responsible to the interest groups, because the interest groups are the other main party and they totally matter. So maybe it's all interest group behavior. So my low estimate, which is probably the one that if I was under oath, and it would be the one I'd probably go with, which was, I think, about 25-ish% was not clearly motivated by anybody else. And I'd take that to mean, FRA to a degree.
Okay, so yeah, we could think about it. You could model that in different ways. You could think about it as a sort of game theoretic Nash bargaining situation, and what you're doing is you're sort of changing the bargaining, the weights in that, the bargaining power of the different parties.
Exactly.
And so when all that's said and done, if you make every assumption against the bureaucrats themselves, the FRA creating the rules according to their own incentives and on their own initiative, your lower bound is 25%, is what I'm hearing. So,
well, I wouldn't say that's totally the case against it, because there's one other group that I firmly believe I'm undercounting. And I think I'm undercounting the president. So I think Congress is pretty correctly measured here.
What number
really
did you get for Congress? What percentage?
I'm looking it up right now. 16%, or so 16% of the share of rules, 29% of the share of discretionary changes.
Right. And Congress, when it's affecting these rules, it had to pass a law, and it's on the books, and then they cite that law, and it's fairly clear.
Not always, because I'm counting like GAO audits, and I'm counting hearings.
Okay.
So they could have a hearing, which is pretty low cost, and then they'll say, we talked about this in the hearing, or GAO did an audit of our books, and they, and a GAO audit is, I'm not going to say it's low cost, but it's all forms of monitoring for Congress are relatively costly. But a GAO audit is not nearly as costly as passing a law.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, but you're fairly sure that 16% for Congress, that's a solid number, and it's surprisingly
16%
low.
16% of rules, 28% of total changes.
Okay.
I think the better measure is of the actual change in word count, because we're really there measuring the sort of effective importance of these rules. And probably my assumption is there's a direct correlation between the costs of a rule and the word count of its text.
I wouldn't be surprised.
I actually have reason to believe this because the way I got into FRA is I did an internship with the Association of American Railroads, which is the main trade association for railroads. And I came up with the Federal Railroad Administration's cumulative regulatory burden, which is where I gathered all of the final rules for FRA and all of the cost data that was included in there. And then I came up with another method of say, tabulating costs. And lo and behold, super correlated, costs and word count, which to me isn't a surprise.
Yeah. Well, they're written in sort of terse legalese, right? Where they don't use any more words than they have to, right? And so words translate directly or fairly directly into rules and restrictions and therefore costs. So that's not surprising. I mean, it's fairly clear that if you have 100 pages of rules versus a 1 page, probably that 100 pages has a lot more costly stuff in it. But that's interesting that you confirm that correlation. And now,
yes,
yeah. So now when future researchers are looking at regulation, they can just cite the word count and I mean, they should probably check, but yeah, that is a good thing to know. So getting back to your results about rule changes is motivated by different groups. Congress, about a quarter, and that one you're fairly certain of. And we were talking about the president. He can make executive orders. What other ways does he affect things?
Yeah, so he has administrators. So there's two ways. The whole literature on the presidency is focused on these two different ways of controlling or influencing the bureaucracy. The first is through executive orders and centralization of policy in the president's office. So the president forces all agencies to submit their regulations to the Organization for Management and Budget and then get reviewed in OIRA, or the Office of Management and Budget. I'm sorry. Jeez, I should know this. And that there's a whole bunch of studies that show that when the administration changes, some measure of something to do with rulemaking changes. Often conservative agencies seem to get less flack, basically, from the administration if the Democrat is or if a Democrat's in office, and vice versa. And so there's measurements of that. The other channel is through his appointees. So the president in the United States appoints, I want to say, something close to 3,000 or 4,000, maybe 5,000 individuals that are at the top of the bureaucracy. So I'm not actually sure how many appointees the Federal Railroad Administration has. I know it has at least one. So 1 out of 300 is an appointee. And so the assumption is that, this is a guy picked by the president to a degree. He probably agrees with the president on a whole host of matters. He may actually have a much more direct line of communication than, say, a normal civil service chief might have. And so there's a direct, and then the administrator himself has his own preferences over what he wants to accomplish. So the administrator, can set the agenda internal to the agency itself. What's not often made clear and what's really hard to disentangle is, first off, is the administrator really doing what he's doing because he knows the president wants it? Or is he doing what he's doing because he himself wants it? So the assignment to an agency is surely a not random process. You're picking somebody with expertise. And so the assumption is he has his own agenda going into this job. And then secondarily to that, even if we assume it's kind of tied to the president, or at least it is coterminous with the president, let's assume that the new guy comes in and says, I just want more or less regulation. I don't really care what type the regulation has. If the bureaucracy then pitches regulations to this principal or to this administrator and says, I think these would be great for all these reasons that I've been thinking about for basically my whole career. And the principal goes, yeah, that's a great idea. And then they issue the regulation. Is it fair to say that that comes from the administrator, or is that really fair to say there's a change in the constraints on the bureaucrat's behavior? And that's, I think that's a much harder point to get at. And there's definitely evidence that it's true. So in my paper, I do an exceptionally simple thing where I just plot the share of total discretion in the issuance of rulemaking by administrator. So I just basically draw this on a graph, and then I put a bunch of lines, and I say, here's where the administrator ends. And you can just spot it and tell that the sort of mean rulemaking, the mean discretion is generally different across administrations.
Right. And I took a look at that graph, and yeah, it's the mid 90s, they change administrators, and the amount of discretion sort of jumps up a couple of years after. So it's not totally one to one. Like there was some time to warm up and possibly other things changing in the background. But yeah, it was somewhat convincing that the person in charge matters.
Yeah, but keep in mind what this is also measuring. This is measuring the outcome of a final rule. The average final rule takes between probably 3 and 6 years to complete. So if it's showing up in year 3, that's actually showing up because it started on day 1 with the new administrator.
Right. Okay. So it makes sense that there would be somewhat of a delay. So the thing that I thought was maybe a point against the idea is maybe not so much of one. Interesting. So you mentioned the bureaucrats and their constraints. One thing you say in the paper, or you argue in the paper, that bureaucrats are unconstrained on the margin. So, what does that mean? What does it mean to be unconstrained on the margin?
Well, what I would interpret that to mean is when we normally think about, say, economic behavior, people are constrained by their budget line rather directly. They have a set amount of income. Every positive price that they pay reduces everything else that they can buy. And it's just terrible. Yeah. And when you're unconstrained on the margin, you're not really facing positive prices. So the only price that in my opinion, a bureaucrat directly faces is the opportunity cost of his time. So you can make a case that, the opportunity cost of the bureaucrat's time might be shirking or slacking or something like that. But if the bureaucrat at all believes in his mission, or at all believes that rulemaking has positive value internal to his own career, you wouldn't expect the bureaucrat to shirk. You would expect him to produce more rules. Because if the bureaucrat believes, I'm going out and I'm saving people's lives, I'm forcing this industry, these dirty polluters to pollute less. I'm forcing these evil businessmen to make sure their employees and their customers are safer. They remember that I really think the best model for regulation is thinking about it as this group of people has determined in the government has determined that the offer that a business provides does not have the right mix of risks. And that's really what they're doing. They're saying this is too risky.
Right. So with regards to potentially their employees, having them in dangerous situations, or potentially their customers, or potentially third parties in the case, especially of environmental regulation.
Absolutely. And my point isn't to say that they might. My point is not saying that they're definitely unjustified in believing that. My point is to say that, on very reasonable assumptions, these people have a direct interest in rulemaking for rulemaking sake.
Yeah. And you sort of contrasted the private person where if I buy something, it means I can't buy something else. You never see someone go to the grocery store and say, yeah, well, I've got everything I need, but I need to buy more so I can spend my whole budget because I want to ask for more next year. Because I mean, obviously they don't ask for it. When you're just shopping for yourself, anything you don't spend goes in, back into your bank account or your investments, and you can spend it on something else. But with these bureaucracies, they face what's called soft budget constraints, where the actual monetary cost is not necessarily a concern. They maybe have some kind of a budget, but if they go over, they can maybe go back to...
No.
Can they go over?
I don't want to get into the rabbit hole of budgets, because this is what made Niskanin's great work forgotten. Is I think a lot of people misread what Niskanin's saying, and they read him as follows. Niskanin says bureaucrats have a basic informational advantage with respect to Congress and other principles, and that they can say pretty much whatever they want, and the other party will have no ability to verify what they're saying. So they can get budgets that are larger than is possible. The nugget of Niskanin's insight is, first off, this basic information asymmetry problem. And then second, that bureaucrats are independent actors that have their own interests and motivations, which may not match any of their principles or any of even the public. And there's a long, I think, public choice tradition, especially from Gordon Tullock and Anthony Downs and Niskanin, on saying that, no, this is silly. These people, of course, they have their own incentive. You can't just assume that away.
Yeah.
And the problem is Niskanin's model was simple, and I think the model was an afterthought to get it into a journal. And the model really said, well, they'll get more budgets, because that was kind of like, what would be the utility gain to doing whatever you want? And my point is to say, let's ignore the budgets. It's not about the budgets. It's about, I want the rule because it looks good on my resume for my next job moving up the bureaucracy. Or I want the rule because I do believe the world will be a better place with this rule. And so I'm willing to expend extra energy to furnish that reality. And that if we really focus on the budgets, the first problem is it's probably empirically wrong, because I just don't think agencies have that much discretion in their budgetary process, at least in the United States. I don't know about other countries, but there's relatively strict civil service rules that state, A, how much can any employee be paid? B, what are the potential other sources of budgets, and how will they be used? And those extra budgets are often, I mean, that's like a favorite of like presidents' things to get rid of, because it's, we're fighting the bureaucracy for possibly good reason. But my point is to say that I just don't expect that much. Budgets are really easy to compete over. So it's really hard for me to believe. And this was the answer that later theorists had, was to say, look, even if there was this kind of issue, you still face the problem where all of the bureaucracies are competing against each other for the same pot of gold. And so at the end of the day, that should produce something like efficient budgets. This is Whitman's answer to that. And my response is to say, no, you fundamentally misunderstand the problem. The problem is not budgets. The problem is they're maximizing against their own preference function, because they don't face constraints on the margin for the behavior that matters, which is really their job function.
Right. And they may have nosy preferences. One of these regulators has the power, with going back to FRA, which you studied directly, the railway industry is a huge, I assume, multi-billion-dollar industry, and a regulator potentially can take some of that multi-billions of dollars controlled by this industry and redirect them. They can redirect them to or from the toilets in the front of the train, or to some other purpose that, who knows what their individual preference is. And, maybe they're good, maybe they're bad.
So this is where the deep Austrian in me kind of comes out and says, well, let's assume they're good, because if we assume they're good and we still get bad outcomes, that's an even stronger case for me. And my point is to say that I think there's reason to believe that people in the bureaucracy are not, say, outwardly malicious. I think that seems like a really good starting assumption. And in fact, they're not just not outwardly malicious. They genuinely want to make the world a better place, and they believe what they're doing does so. Mm-hmm. And so then the question is that true? That's a much longer question for a very different post or very different discussion that I can talk at length about as well for my own beliefs there. But I don't get into that here because that would be outside the scope of this project. But I definitely think whether the bureaucracy has discretion and how much discretion it has and how much discretion the bureaucracy is able to utilize is directly related to the question of, whether the bureaucracy can with beneficially motivated actors produce excellent results.
Right. And if they and do they is your point that they face the sort of same problems of centrally planning? You take something big and complex like a whole industry, and it's very hard, even for someone with a lot of knowledge about it, to reorganize it or impose rules that are going to have the exact effect that they want them to, because of course they may create unintended consequences. The rules may not work out in the way they intend or believe they will.
I see no difference between assigning a bundle of risks and assigning a positive price over a good.
Right. And so the point being that it's very hard to set a price. Right. If we rely on supply and demand, we're going to get a price that reflects market conditions, but it's very hard to, apropos of nothing, say this good ought to cost this much. You just can't take all of the relevant factors into account. And with regulators, it's not a price, it's, as you say, a bundle of risks. How safe is my car going to be? How safe are trains going to be? Who has a potential downside if something goes wrong? If anything, that's more complex and therefore more difficult for even a well-meaning actor to improve on.
Right. And I just want to note that think about how how any given bureaucrat could be constrained. They're constrained by, say, their office environment and how permissive it is of rulemaking. They're constrained by how many things they have to do for Congress because Congress has told them a whole bunch of things to do. And they only have a limited number of hours in the day. So the opportunity cost of the rulemaking project I've always wanted is really the other rulemaking project.
My guest today has been Stephen M. Jones. Stephen, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.